Hi, Ikrananka here, and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this series of videos, I'm going to be covering how to get started with the game B-17 Flying Fortress The Mighty Eighth. This first video is going to cover the initial installation, the setup and controls. Then I'll move on to further videos covering my recommended mods and how to install them. I'll touch on the R&R Realism project. I'll provide some gameplay tips, as well as videos covering the game's tutorials. The final Getting Started video will put everything learned so far into practice by completing one of the individual historical missions. Now, just a little background to the game. It was developed by a UK-based development studio called Wayward Design, who were, at the time of publication, a subsidiary of Rage Software. The game was originally published by Microprose in December 2000, whereas today it is published by Retroism and Night Dive Studios, and is available from GOG DRM-free and also from Steam. I'll provide links in the video description below. One thing you've got to bear in mind with this game is it is very complicated and it does require some patience to master, but it is worthwhile doing so. I personally find the game really enjoyable to play. I believe it's a really credible representation of the trials and tribulations of managing and carrying out the Mighty Eighth's bombing missions, and I believe it's currently without a doubt the best that is available. Now, Wayward Design were clearly very aware of the game's complexity, and great effort must have been expended to ensure playability despite the complex nature of the game. As such, the game includes a remarkably good AI that takes over control of most aspects of the game, allowing the player to take manual control of individual components as desired. So while the game it models all 10 crew members, and the AI controls each one of those members based on each crew member's level of experience as well as morale, you can take over manual control of any one of those crew members. Now, one of the fun things about the game is the fact that you can take over and play each and every individual crew member. So you can, for instance, jump into any one of the gunners' seats and fire the machine guns at the enemy aircraft attacking you. You can jump into the bombardier's seat, control the Norden bomb site and drop the bombs on target. You can jump into the navigator's role and ensure that the aircraft stays on course. You can jump into the pilot or co-pilot seats and fly the plane. It's also got detailed engine management, so you've got all the controls associated with that, as well as monitoring of the fuel levels. And if fuel levels need to be adjusted, you can, as was the case in reality, jump into the engineer's role, who is also the top turret gunner, and actually transfer fuel between the fuel tanks. And all of that is modeled within the game, which is superb. But one thing to bear in mind is that even at its simplest level, this game does have a rather steep learning curve, particularly with the control scheme, which is a bit quirky and a little bit difficult to get used to. You just have to spend the time to learn the key controls. Now, there are a lot of controls in the game that you may never actually touch on, and there are some controls that I never use. And later on in this video, I will show the main controls that I use, and I'll also just touch on some of those controls which I use to a much lesser extent that you can maybe just skip for now. And then once you've got used to the game and you're beginning to feel confident enough, that you can then start to apply using the additional controls that I touch on. There are also a few minor issues and quirks that need to be overcome with this game, including how to get rid of the window that appears around the game screen, as well as how to adjust the sensitivity on your joystick so that, one, it's appropriate for flying the plane, but secondly also for aiming the machine guns, which unfortunately aiming the machine guns can only really be achieved with a joystick. Just bear that in mind, that if you're wanting to play this game, you will need a joystick. It's just impossible to control the guns in any reasonable fashion without one. There are also a number of really good mods that I would recommend you implement, and I'll cover those in a later video. Now, B-17 Flying Fortress The Mighty Eighth is currently available to buy on both GOG and Steam, and I'll put links to both of the store pages that are on screen now in the video description below. Now, as far as I'm aware, the two versions are essentially identical, other than I do believe that the Steam version is DRM protected, The only other difference that I can potentially think there may be is on Windows compatibility, where GOG shows Windows compatibility from Windows XP, Vista 7, 8 and 10, whereas the Steam store page only shows compatibility up to Windows 7. It doesn't show compatibility with Windows 8 or 10. Now, if that's of concern to you, then I would just simply purchase the GOG version. Now, moving on to installation, I own the GOG version of the game, and as can be seen here, this is the latest setup file. I'll just go ahead and kick off the install. Select yes when the user account dialog box is displayed. So the first step in the game installation is to choose the language. There's German, English or French options available here. I'm just going to choose English as the default for myself. And I'll click on the yes, I accept the terms and conditions. And it is possible to change the default installation directory by clicking on the options button here and using the browse to change location. I'm just going to install in that default location, so we'll click on install. So while the installation is proceeding, I will just note that I've completed this under both Windows 7 and Windows 10 64-bit and have had absolutely no problems at all with the installation itself. Now, upon running the game, I have found that in both instances the game is displayed with a window and title bar associated with it, neither of which is really desirable. So there is a workaround to remove that, and I will cover that in a later section of this video. Now, setting up B-17 is a little bit of a complicated multi-step process. In this initial setup section of the video, I'll cover the first major steps of setting the game up to ensure that it plays well and looks good. But I will leave setting up of the controls until later on in this video, after the section covering joysticks. So moving on, when you first start the game up, you should be presented with this B-17 setup dialog box. If not, it can be accessed directly by running the B-17 setup application file that's located in the game's install folder. And just for your interest, if you actually want to bypass this setup program when running the game in the future, you can run the game directly by running the start application, again located in the game's install folder. So now moving on to the setup of the game itself, we'll start off on the first tab of the dialog here, the graphics tab. Now the first option you have is the selection of the display driver. Now I have just one display driver, and that's an AMD Radeon R9 390 series, so for me this is a simple option just to select the primary, but obviously select the display driver that you wish to use for the game. Secondly, you have the game resolution, color depth and the refresh rate to select from. Choose these within the limitations of your system. Now for me, my monitor is running at 3440 by 1440, so I can set the game to its maximum resolution. And I'm also running a fairly modern fast machine, so I'll choose the highest color depth of 32. And to maximize frames per second, on my LCD monitor, I'm going to choose a refresh rate of 60 Hz. But again, as I say, choose the settings that work within the limitations of your system. Now, there is another option here, use hardware, transform and lighting. Now, that will improve the graphical quality of the game, so if you have that option, turn it on. That's highly recommended. Associated with the graphic settings, I also recommend that you go to your video card's control settings and turn on scaling. I'm using an AMD, as I said before, and under here the scaling option is under display, and then turn on GPU scaling. I'm also setting the scaling mode to preserve aspect ratio. I personally like the games, if it's a 4x3 game, for instance, then I like to actually run the game in 4x3. I don't like stretching games personally. But obviously, choose whichever option works for you and whatever your preference is. Now, moving on to the next tab of the game setup, we'll look at sound. There's only one option here, and that is to turn on the old Arial A3D pseudo surround system if you have it. Now, it's highly unlikely, I suspect, that you do, considering that Creative Labs killed this technology off many years ago. Unless you're using an old Arial sound card, I suspect that you don't have this. If you don't, then this will be grayed out as it is for me. The final option is to create a graphics cache. And as it says here, creating a graphics cache will use more hard disk space but will improve performance. I suspect with virtually everybody who's playing this game these days that performance is far more important than hard disk space. And that hard disk space is hardly likely to be an issue for you. If that is the case, then I highly recommend going ahead and creating that graphics cache to make the game run more smoothly. So they're the main settings within this portion. What we'll now move on to look at are the settings within the game. So go ahead and fire up the game by clicking on the Play B-17 button here. So on first starting the game, I think the first thing you'll notice is that there is a window border around the edge of the game screen and a title bar at the top. As I mentioned before, I'll show you how to get rid of these in a later section of this video. But for now, I'll get rid of them as we proceed through the game options. There, that looks much better. Okay, so now we'll look at the main options within the game itself. And on the title screen, you'll see this options panel, which we'll click on to highlight, and then click on this switch in the lower right-hand corner to continue. We're then presented with the 5 main option panels. The first on the top left is the controls menu, and I'll cover this later in the video after the section covering joysticks. So we'll just move clockwise through the panels. So we'll move over to the graphics menu on the top right. So we'll highlight that panel and we'll click the forward switch. And here we're presented with a number of options all covering the graphics aspect of the game. Now by default these are all set to balanced, but you have the option to change them to speed, which is effectively the same as lower detail or lower complexity, and obviously detailed, which is a higher level of graphical quality or complexity. So this game was published, as I said earlier in the video, in 2000 or at the end of 2000. And so I suspect with most PCs today that they would easily be able to run this game with them all set to detail. Now that's what I do. I turn all of these to detail settings and have absolutely no issues running the game whatsoever. If you have a laptop with a low-end video card, mind you, you may need to turn some of these down back to balanced, or you may even need to turn some down to speed. That's something you're going to have to experiment with to see what works for you. I'll just touch on this one setting here, non-player B-17s. This one's a little different. It doesn't actually change the graphical quality of the game. What it does do is it changes the number of B-17s that are displayed flying in formation with your squadron. Now when I say your squadron, the game revolves around you having a squadron of 6 core B-17s. Now when you play a squadron commander game, you have control over those 6 aircraft and you can move between each one of them or amongst them all. Now when you play any other game other than the Squadron Commander campaign, you'll only be in control of the lead B-17 out of the squadron of 6. Now what this setting here under the graphical options does is it allows you to display on screen either an additional 6 or 12 B-17s, so an additional 1 or 2 squadrons. Now these are referred to as ghost ships, and they do not directly contribute to any bombing or bombing damage And also I believe they don't directly contribute to firing on fighters and damage to those fighter planes. So although graphically it looks better to have the 18, it actually makes no difference to the gameplay whether you've only got the 6 being displayed or 12 or 18. So this is essentially what this option does, is when it's set on balanced, it will display 12 B-17s. If you have it set on speed, it will only display your core squadron of 6. If you have it set on detail, it will display a full complement of 3 squadrons, so 18 B-17s in total. Because I like the look of the 18 flying, it looks kind of cool having the full 3 squadrons there, particularly when they're making turns in unison, etc. Then it's worthwhile having it set on detail. One thing I would note though is that the Ghost B-17s do sustain damage and they can be destroyed or lost in the game due to involvement with flak or enemy fighters attacking, but they have absolutely no impact on your performance within the game. So what we'll do is we'll just set all of these to detail. Scroll down and get the last 2. And we'll click on the continue switch in the lower right hand corner. It's critical you click on that switch if you want to save the changes. If you actually want to cancel and discard any changes, then you click on this lower left switch. I'm going to save those, so I'll click on the lower right. So that's the graphics menu. We'll now move round to the sound options by clicking on the sound panel and then the forward switch. Now the only sound option in terms of quality here is this ambient detail, and you have 3 options: low, medium or high. I think it's fairly self-explanatory what this does. I don't know the details of what particular aspects these various settings impact, but clearly on a reasonable system with a fairly good sound system and sound card, high should be perfectly workable for you. Again, laptops may have more restrictions and more limitations that you may need to turn that down. I like to have it on high. The only other pieces in here all revolve around the various sound volumes within the game. So you've got options around the level of sound for engine, gun, speech, mechanical, bomb and flak, and the overall sound volume from the game. And again, each one of these has an option to either ramp down the volume or actually turn that specific aspect of sound in the game off. I leave them all at default. I think the sounds actually sound really good, and the default volumes all seem to work pretty well together. So because I changed ambient detail to high, I will go ahead and save those changes. The next panel is the game load and save menu. That's obviously only applicable to when you've completed a mission or missions and you've saved games that you maybe want to load later. So this is where you would come to do that. The final panel here is the realism and difficulty menu, and this is a fairly significant aspect of the game. So I highly recommend you do go into this and make any adjustments necessary. I'll make some recommendations in here, and so I'll talk through those as we go through it. So again, we'll highlight that panel and click forward to go into this section. So the first item is flak accuracy. The default is what they call veteran. Now that's a bit of a strange naming system here, but basically it's low, medium and high is the effective levels here, in that what this does is it affects the flak density, which when looked at in a different way, it directly affects the likelihood of you being hit by flak as you're flying through it. So it's a chance of being hit. So if you were to change this from veteran to elite, the game settings by default are such that elite means you would have a 50% greater chance of being hit by flak than if you had it set at veteran. Rookie, on the other hand, has a 25% lower chance of you being hit by flak, relative to veteran. I just leave it as default. I kind of assume that's what they believed was a relatively historical setting. And so you can have a play around with that and see what you think. I may try playing it on Elite one day. It would be quite interesting to see what that's like flying through those very dense flak fields. The next two items are fairly self-explanatory. We've got enemy and friendly fighter skills. You can either choose from rookie, veteran, or elite. And they really obviously directly affect the skill levels of the pilots of those fighters. I again leave those at veteran. Again, I'm assuming that the developers believe that was a reasonable measure of historical accuracy. Ammunition quantity is next. Now, by default, this is set to historical, which in the case of the B-17s means 2,000 rounds per machine gun location, except for the left and right waist gunners, who both only got 1,000 rounds each, and the cheek gunner, who also only gets 1,000 rounds. You have the option of either doubling up those ammunition levels or making them unlimited. I really enjoy trying to shoot down the enemy fighters, and as such, I like the challenge of having a limited quantity of ammunition to do that with. Now, that said, it is worth noting that in reality, B-17 crews would load up with extra ammunition when it was perhaps a long run deep into enemy territory, or if significant enemy fighter activity was expected. In these cases, it would certainly be reasonable to select double ammunition before flying these kinds of missions in the game. For now, I'll leave it set at historical. Fuel quantity is next. That has similar parameters to ammunition in that you have historical, double, or unlimited. Again, these obviously will make the game easier and make it less of a challenge with regards to having to monitor fuel levels, particularly if the fuel tanks have been hit and you're actually leaking fuel. I like to leave it on historical again. It makes it for more of a challenging game. Bomb damage is the next item. The default is historical without duds. Now, in reality, the word dud bombs, why the developers set the game default to historical without duds, I don't know. But what I always do is just leave this set at the default of historical without duds. It would actually be kind of interesting to play with duds. I have no idea what percentage or what mechanism they use to determine if a bomb is a dud or not, whether it uses some kind of randomizer or whether it's a fixed percentage. But it would be kind of cool just to play the historical to see what the reduced damage associated with those you having a portion of dud bombs would be. So you have that option to play around with. You can also double the bomb damage without duds, which will obviously make the game much easier with regards to achieving damage to the targets you're trying to hit. So anyway, I will leave that historical without duds. B-17 durability. B-17s were very well known for how much punishment they could take before they would actually really start to lose integrity. So I think the historical is actually a pretty robust play to start with. But you can artificially increase that durability by selecting enhanced or even invulnerable. Again, they just will make the game easier. Again, I like the challenge of trying to keep the planes going with the damage as they are historically modeled. Anyway, that's B-17 durability. Norden complexity is next. Now, the Norden bomb sight is used for targeting your bombs, and this has two options: full complexity or simplified. I'll be frank, I don't know what the simplified option does. I did start a game with it on simplified and just could not discern what the simplified controls were. It seemed to operate the same way as it did with full complexity. Unfortunately, the manual doesn't provide any insight into that whatsoever. I actually like manually bombing. I think it's a good task. It's a good challenge. It's quite fun trying to get the bombs on target. And after all, that's the entire premise and objective of flying these B-17s, is to bomb and do damage to your targets. So I recommend leaving this at full complexity. If you actually don't want to do any bombing, then you can just not step into the bombardier's shoes during the bomb run and the AI will take control. Now, initially in campaigns, your bombardier won't have a great deal of experience, and therefore the AI will miss on many occasions in those early missions. But as you progress through those campaigns, your bombardier will gain experience, and therefore the AI bombing will improve. And in actual fact, if you manually take control of a crew member, the rate of gain of experience for that crew member is greatly accelerated. And so I highly recommend you try doing manual bombing. It's a really key aspect of this game. The next item is navigation complexity. Again, you've got 3 levels here. You've got the historical default, and you've got easy and flawless. Now, personally, I find the navigation really boring in the game and a real irritant, so I tend to flip this one to flawless. It's the easiest option, and it means you can basically ignore navigation. If you don't want to and you do historical, then you will get nagged occasionally through the game that you are off course, and what you have to do is to manually step into the navigator's role, look at the map, look at the outside of the plane and look at the ground, try and find landmarks, try and match them up on the map, and then you use the airplane marker on the map and move it from where the game is showing you your plane is to where your plane actually is based on your viewing landmarks from out of the B-17 external views. You could say, okay, so it's another key aspect of the game, but as I say, I tend to find it rather boring. So it's simply just moving a marker on a map, and that's it. It really doesn't replicate the complexity of real navigation at all. So anyway, I leave it on flawless just to eliminate that from the equation. But have a play around and see what you like. The next item is the friendly bullet strength, which you can adjust from the historical strength. And this is obviously a measure of how much damage they do. Or you can make the game easier in that regard by selecting increased or doubled. I always just leave that on historical. Then you have G-force effects on the pilot. Now this affects all pilots, including the B-17s and all of the fighter planes, friendly and enemy. It really is more applicable to the fighter planes. They're the ones which are flying at far faster speeds and doing tight turns or descending rapidly, and therefore they're the ones that are going to be subjected to G-force far more than the likelihood of the B-17 pilots being affected. And what this does is that the game models the likelihood or chances of the pilots losing consciousness and therefore control of their planes. And so this allows you to have some control over that, in that you can either reduce the G-force effects on the pilot or actually eliminate that altogether. I, again, like kind of to try and keep this as historical as possible, I just always leave that on the default of accurate, but you can again have a play around with those settings. The next option is a really key one in this game to change. The default is ground and other aircraft, and so this means that if any plane hits the ground, then it will be assessed for damage, depending obviously on the speed and angle of impact. But it also models aircraft hitting other aircraft, and it determines if there is any damage from that aircraft-aircraft interaction. Now that all sounds well and good. The problem is that enemy fighter planes all too often in this game will kamikaze attack the B-17s. I don't know if this is really by design or whether it's just a poor AI, but the outcome is that you will lose many B-17s to these kamikaze attacks, and far more than occurred in reality. Now when this occurs, I guarantee you will feel cheated, and the only solution is to change this setting for collision damage to ground only. This has the effect of preventing damage from the kamikaze attacks, not only to the B-17 being hit, but also to the enemy fighter. So in some ways, it balances itself out. Now the downside of this is that legitimate aircraft collisions, such as damaged B-17s hitting other B-17s during tight turns, results in no damage to either plane, and the two planes appear to bounce off of each other, and then they slowly return to the formation. This, however, I believe, is a necessary compromise. So I'll leave that at ground damage only. Now, the next item is just a general difficulty setting. I don't specifically know all the parameters this affects, but one parameter that I do know that is included here is engine management, which was a feature that was introduced by Wayward Design in April 2001 when they released their final patch for the game, bringing the game up to version 2.0. Now, in this setting, it's left at its default of medium. This provides for full modeling of engine management, as well as having full AI control over those engine management parameters. Now, if you turn this setting up to high, it introduces the additional challenge of modeling damage on the engines and its effect on engine management. For instance, when an engine is damaged, it suffers from a heating penalty. Therefore, damaged engines will tend to overheat more at the same power levels. Conversely, if you select low under general difficulty, this not only turns off the damage modeling, it also turns off the complex engine management and the AI associated with it. Now, I enjoy the challenge of full engine management in the game, and also the additional challenge that full damage modeling brings, making the game much more realistic. So therefore, I tend to leave this setting on high. However, if you're new to the game, I would suggest that you leave this setting on medium and allow the AI to take full control of engine management, and with no risk that the engines will suffer from any damage penalties. The next item is weather severity. Now, whether this affects the wind speed changes, wind gust speed, as well as the level of cloud cover. And there are various scalars amongst these three items, in that if you choose light, then each one of those parameters I said, the wind speeds and the cloud cover for light, would be reduced by 30% relative to moderate. And if you chose severe, all those parameters are 20% more severe relative to moderate. So that's quite a cool thing, is that you can actually make the weather a bit more severe if you choose to do so. I tend to leave this on moderate, again, under the belief that's what the developers felt was probably the best to play along with. But it would be, again, kind of cool to set some of these to their harder settings to see how much more of an additional challenge that provides in the game. So we'll leave that at moderate as it is. Now, crew autonomy is the next item. And this is a measure of, effectively, of the crew's initiative in terms of how they react to external stimuli. External stimuli in this case is mainly when a fire occurs within a B-17, or one of your comrades is wounded and they require first aid, and therefore it's how likely a certain crew member is to respond to a fire, and therefore going to get a fire extinguisher to put the fire out, or to go and give first aid unprompted to a wounded crew member. And it's normally set to superior initiative by default. Now, if you set this to normal, then it reduces the initiative by about 20% relative to superior. If you set it to limited, then it's only 40% of the superior initiative level. And you can obviously also turn initiative off completely, in which case none of the crew will ever independently respond to fires or the need for first aid. Another key aspect of this to remember is that this only affects your player-controlled bomber. So if you're, for instance, in a Squadron Commander game and you're moving amongst your 6 bombers, then as you change to a different bomber, all of the crew within the bomber you then therefore are currently under control, all of the crew will be subject to superior initiative, or the initiative that you have set here. So you could say no initiative, and that forces you as the player to have to respond to fire and first aid requests entirely by yourself. But if you're in a Squadron Commander game and you're in one of the B-17s and controlling it, all of the other 5 B-17s and their crews will all be set by default to superior initiative. So even if you set no initiative here, the planes you're not controlling, the crews will actually respond to fire and first aid requests. So it just adds a challenge to the B-17 that you are currently occupying, which is kind of cool. Now, I always leave this at the default of superior initiative. Now, the last game option is the fighter gun convergence range. As it infers by the name, this obviously only affects fighter pilots. And it's effectively a measure of how skilled the pilots are. So if you were to set this at the extreme of, say, 600 yards, then you need to be a very experienced pilot to be able to accurately aim your guns and fire and hit a B-17 from 600 yards. And so that's where you'd set your convergence range when you've got very skilled pilots. If you've got very unskilled pilots, conversely, you would set that at 150 yards, in that they need to get much, much closer to the B-17s to hit them. The default setting is 300, which I guess is, clearly a middle ground. This is something I've never really played around with. I've never really tracked the experience and skill of the fighter pilots in the game. So I've always just left this on 300. But again, it would be an interesting thing to get into to see how that affects things by making changes relative to your pilot skill level. So again, when you've finished making your changes in this section, don't forget to click on the lower right switch to continue and save those changes. And that's it. That's all of the main game options that are required to be changed. So we'll stop there and move on to the next section. This section of the video deals with how to remove the ugly title bar and border from around the game screen. So the first thing you need to do is to download a piece of software called Win Explorer by Nearsoft. And this can be obtained by going to this web address, and I'll put a link in the video description below, and then scrolling to the bottom of this page and clicking on the Download Win Explorer link. So having downloaded the Win Explorer program, you'll have access to the zip archive file. So the first thing to do is to extract that to a convenient location. And then we can delete the unnecessary components that are in here. We can get rid of the DLL file, which is only needed for Windows NT systems. The help file can go, and we'll get rid of the original zip archive. What we now want to do is to create a shortcut to this. And under that shortcut, we're going to turn on, under Properties Compatibility, that this program needs to be run as an administrator all the time. You can then move this shortcut to the desktop, which is a location where I keep mine. So now, to use this program, first of all, we need to start B-17. So you'll have the game running. You'll have the border shown around it and the title bar, and then you'll want to Alt-Tab out of B-17 back to the desktop. And once there, you can then run the Win Explorer program. You'll be presented with a user account control dialog box, which you can just select yes at, and then the program itself will run. Now within here, you'll see a list of running programs on your system, and you want to scroll down through those until you find the game that's running in the background, B-17 the Mighty Eighth. And this is the one that has the airplane icon to the left hand side. So once you're in there and you have that highlighted, click on the Style tab, and then you want to turn off two components. There's this WS_DLG frame and also WS_border. So we'll turn those two components off, and then we can close the Win Explore program. Now, when you go back to the game by clicking on the icon that's sitting in the taskbar, you will see that the game is presented without the title bar and the border. Fantastic. Now, B-17 the Mighty Eighth is best played with the aid of a joystick. That is, a combination of a joystick, the keyboard, and a mouse. The game can be played reasonably well with just a keyboard and mouse if you don't want to manually fly any planes or use and target the B-17 machine guns. In my view, these tasks are just too awkward and difficult to do using the keyboard controls. Plus, you'll be missing out on some of the most fun and challenging aspects of the game. So I recommend using a HOTUS joystick setup, i.e. a hands-on throttle and stick. Personally, I use the very cost-effective entry-level Thrustmaster T.Flight HOTUS X. However, that has now been discontinued and has been replaced by the Thrustmaster T.Flight HOTUS 4 as shown on screen now. Having checked reviews comparing the HOTUS 4 against the prior HOTUS X, the reviews do seem to indicate that improvements have been made. Specifically, the dead zone of the HOTUS X has been drastically reduced in the HOTUS 4. And the HOTUS 4 also has an upgradable firmware, and so hopefully improvements will continue to be rolled out in the future. So based on that, I would highly recommend, if you're looking for an entry-level HOTUS, to go ahead and buy the Thrustmaster T.Flight HOTUS 4 for playing B-17, the Mighty Eighth. Now, when selecting your joystick for B-17, I would highly recommend you choose one that includes a POV or point of view hat switch, such as that provided on the T.Flight HOTUS 4. This is used in B-17 to switch between views when occupying the pilot or co-pilot positions, as well as some of the machine gun positions. This is very useful when trying to see the status of the engines and propellers, as well as the movements of enemy fighters when they are outside of the main view. So what I'm going to demonstrate here are the various additional views that are accessible via the point of view hat switch. And first of all, we have additional views via the pilot and the co-pilot. So now I've got the pilot selected here. I'm going to press the A key to select the action view. Then I'm going to press the POV switch to the left and right, as well as the upper left and upper right. So here we have left, upper left, right, and upper right. Now similarly, we can do the same thing with the co-pilot. Again, we'll show you the left view, the upper left view, the right view, there's that annoying navigator, and the upper right view. Now we'll move to the next location where these are available, and we'll move to the top turret gunner. I'll just switch this to manual so it stops flying around. And this has one additional view available, which is to look up. So we'll first of all start off by looking left, the upper left view, the right view, and the upper right view. And as I say, the additional one is if I pull back on the POV switch, there's a view directly looking up, which all we can see here quite clearly are the clouds in the sky. So the next position where these additional views are available is the ball turret gunner. And again, I'm going to put that into manual mode to stop it moving around. And here we have just the left, right, upper left, and upper right views. So first of all, left, upper left, right, and upper right. And the final position with additional views available is the tail gunner. And here we have left, upper left, right, and upper right. There's that navigator again. Okay, and we also, if I pull back on the POV switch, we get an up view, which really serves absolutely no purpose because it just shows you the roof. Okay. So they are all the additional positions and views that are available via the POV hat switch on your joystick. Although these additional views are also available via the camera movement keys on the number keypad on the keyboard, this is quite awkward to do, as it requires your hand to let go of your joystick, then move it to one side of the keyboard to the number keypad, and then move it back to your joystick again. However, having a POV hat switch on your joystick that is easily accessible by your thumb allows your hand to stay firmly on your joystick while you use your thumb to move the camera around. Now, it's important to be aware that the POV switch is automatically detected by the program and you can't configure it via the game options. So I cannot stress enough how important it is to have a joystick with a POV hat switch. Having access to those additional views is really useful in-game for checking engine and propeller status, as well as for tracking enemy fighters. Regardless of which joystick or HOTAS you have, you may run into issues where the joystick is too sensitive or too responsive when playing B-17 the Mighty 8. Certainly I have found my T.Flight HOTAS X to be much too sensitive, making movement and targeting of the B-17 machine guns all but impossible. Unfortunately, the game does not include any inbuilt ability to adjust joystick sensitivity, and neither does Windows. And so I will cover how to adjust joystick sensitivity and how to set this up in B-17 in the next video in this Getting Started series. Before starting up B-17 to set up the main game controls, it's critical that you plug in your joystick beforehand and make sure it's been correctly recognized by Windows. Only then should you kick off the B-17 game. In fact, it's critical that you do this every single time that you want to play the game. Make sure that the joystick is plugged in and recognized beforehand. The reason for this is if you don't do that, then when you start B-17 with your joystick unplugged, the settings will reset to their defaults and you'll lose any joystick settings that you previously had configured. At the end of this section, I will show you how to back up your settings once you have them set up and how to reinstate them should the worst happen and they get overwritten. So, having plugged in your joystick and started up the B-17 game, to set up the main game controls, we'll first select the options panel here on the lower left and then the continue switch on the lower right. And then we'll select the controls menu panel up on the upper left here, and then we'll click on the forward switch lower right. Now you'll then be presented with a large number of controls that can be configured within the game. Now don't be put off by this, I only actually use a relatively small subset of these controls and I suspect that you will likely too. I'll also just note that while you're making changes to these controls, that if you do at any time want to reset them to their defaults, you can do so by just clicking on this red button here. However, please be aware that that will reset all of the controls that you have changed to their defaults. It will not just change the one that you are working on at that moment. So now we'll start working through the controls that I like to set up when playing B-17. Now first of all, we'll start with the assignments of pitch, roll and yaw to the joystick. Now when you first of all click on pitch, you'll be presented with the various parameters around that item here. Now you'll see the keys that are pre-assigned to it, and you'll also see down here that a joystick has also been detected and assigned to that axis. In this case it says axis 2, Y, controller number 1. Now we need to verify that that is indeed the joystick that we have plugged in and is assigned to the correct axis. And we can do that by moving our joystick by pushing it forward and pulling it back and verifying movement in this gauge down in the bottom half of the screen here. Now if you don't see any movement there, then clearly the program has not correctly identified your joystick. So first of all you want to click on this axis line so that it changes to scanning, and then move your joystick along the axis that you're assigning, in this case pitch, so forward and back, and you should see your joystick being correctly detected. And as we can see here, it has indeed come back up with exactly the same as it had before, axis number 2, controller number 1. We'll then do the same for roll, and we'll verify that this has been automatically detected correctly. And so I'm going to move my joystick to the left and to the right and verify movement in the gauge below. And then I'll move on to yaw, and I will twist my joystick left and right, and indeed the gauge moves. So in each one of those cases, the axis and controller have already been correctly detected and set up. And we'll move on to flaps, and as we can see, when I select flaps up and down, they both have a button that you can assign to that particular parameter. In this case, I want to assign a button on my throttle to flaps up and a different button on my throttle to flaps down. And to do that, I click on flaps up, click on this activate line, and again it changes to scanning, and I will press the button on my throttle control, and that has been correctly identified. So that's button number 5 on my HOTAS X So I can do the similar thing with flaps down, click on flaps down, activate, and then I'm going to click on the button I want to assign to flaps down. Now the reason I do that is because I find it quite useful during takeoff and landing while I'm adjusting the throttle of the B-17 to have the flaps up and down directly accessible right by my thumb. It's worth being aware also that you can set partial flaps, but the only way you can do this is by going to the cockpit and the instrument panel of the B-17 while you're playing in game, and then using the mouse to select the flaps control on the instrument panel. Now the downside of that is that while you're doing that, you don't see out of the window, and so you are effectively flying blind while you are partially adjusting your flaps. So I tend to avoid doing that and just use 100% flaps during takeoff and landing, and then just fully retract them after the event. The next item I like to assign to the joystick are the steering brakes, and what you'll actually note here is that the yaw with keys N and B and axis 4 on my controller are also assigned to the steering brakes. So effectively your rudder and your steering brakes use exactly the same controls, and that works fine. And again, we'll note by my using the yaw, by twisting my joystick left and right, that the steering brakes gauge also moves left and right. And don't forget that the steering brakes are used during taxiing while you're on the ground. The next item I like to assign to my joystick are the raising and lowering of the landing gear. And so I assign raising all of the landing gear again to a button on my joystick. And in this case I use button 7 on my HOTUS X. And for lowering the landing gear, I use button number 8. The only other parameter I like to check is to ensure that the throttle control for all of the throttles has been assigned to the throttle controller in my HOTUS setup. So if I go to all throttles, I'll note that it has detected an axis and controller there, and what I'm going to do now is to push my throttle all the way forward and pull it all the way back to verify that this gauge moves. Again, if you're not getting movement there on your throttle control, click on this axis line, move your throttle all the way down to 0 and push it all the way up to 100%, and it should detect your throttle correctly. The only other joystick controls that I set and verify are those for firing the machine gun, which can be found much further down the list of controls. Now, if I select machine guns here, you can see that it's automatically detected button number 1 on my HOTUS X controller. And that is the trigger on the joystick, and I'm quite happy to leave it at that. Now on the cannons, these only apply to fighters, and it has automatically assigned button number 2, which is the thumb button on the top of my HOTUS X joystick. And again, I'm happy to leave it at that. And that's it. They are all of the changes that I normally make to the controls. So we'll just save those changes by clicking on the Continue Save Changes switch on the right hand side here. And that's it. That's the game all set up and ready to play. Now I will just move on to show you how to back up those changes in case that you do lose them by inadvertently starting the game without a joystick plugged in. So to back up all of the game settings, you need to first of all quit the game, and then within File Explorer in Windows, navigate to the game's installation folder. In my case here, it's on the C drive under GOG Games, and then B-17 Flying Fortress. Now you need to then open up the Options folder, and if I sort on Date Modified here, as I have already done, you'll see that I have 2 files which have been modified as I have changed options in the game. Now there's only one of these which you actually need to create a backup of, and that's the b17.opt file. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a copy of that file by selecting copy and then paste. And now we have this file B-17-copy, which acts as our backup. Now obviously if you inadvertently do plug in your joystick after you've started the game and you need to reinstate the settings that you have previously created by restoring this backup copy, it's simply a matter of just deleting the B-17 opt file, creating another copy and pasting the backup file and then renaming that to B-17.opt. And that will serve to reinstate your settings that you had previously backed up. Okay folks, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you like this video, please let me know in the comment section below and like the video. If you want to subscribe, I'd very much appreciate you following along with my future videos. I plan on doing many more. The next video in this Getting Started series will cover joystick sensitivity and how to set that up and implement that within B-17. So please have a look at that. And I've got plenty of other Getting Started videos to come. So thank you very much for watching again and take care. Bye-bye.